Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 23. Clara. Robert Audley found the driver asleep upon the box of his lumbering vehicle. He had been entertained with beer of so hard a nature as to induce temporary strangulation in the daring imbiber thereof, and he was very glad to welcome the return of his fare. The old white horse, who looked as if he had been foaled in the year in which the carriage had been built, and seemed, like the carriage, to have outlived the fashion, was as fast asleep as his master, and woke up with a jerk as Robert came down the stony flight of steps, attended by his executioner, who waited respectfully till Mr. Audley had entered the vehicle and been turned off. The horse, roused by a smack of his driver's whip and a shake of the shabby reins, crawled off in a semi-somnambulant state, and Robert, with his hat very much over his eyes, thought of his missing friend. He had played in these stiff gardens, and under these dreary firs, years ago, perhaps, if it were possible for the most frolicsome youth to be playful within the range of Mr. Harcourt Talboys' hard gray eyes. He had played beneath these dark trees, perhaps, with the sister who had heard of his fate to-day without a tear. Robert Audley looked at the rigid primness of the orderly grounds, wondering how George could have grown up in such a place to be the frank, generous, careless friend whom he had known. How was it that with his father perpetually before his eyes, he had not grown up after the father's disagreeable model, to be a nuisance to his fellow men? How was it? Because we have some one higher than our parents to thank for the souls which make us great or small, and because while family noses and family chins may descend in orderly sequence from father to son, from grandsire to grandchild, as the fashion of the fading flowers of one year is reproduced in the budding blossoms of the next, the spirit, more subtle than the wind which blows among these flowers, independent of all earthly rule, owns no order but the harmonious law of God. "Thank God," thought Robert Audley. "Thank God, it is over. My poor friend must rest in his unknown grave, and I shall not be the means of bringing disgrace upon those I love. It will come, perhaps, sooner or later, but it will not come through me. The crisis is past, and I am free." He felt an unutterable relief in this thought. His generous nature revolted at the office into which he had found himself drawn, the office of spy, the collector of damning facts that led on to horrible deductions. He drew a long breath, a sigh of relief at his release. It was all over now. The fly was crawling out of the gate of the plantation as he thought this, and he stood up in the vehicle to look back at the dreary fir trees, the gravel paths, the smooth grass, and the great desolate-looking red-brick mansion. He was startled by the appearance of a woman running, almost flying, along the carriage drive by which he had come, and waving a handkerchief in her uplifted hand. He stared at this singular apparition for some moments in silent wonder before he was able to reduce his stupefaction into words. "Is it me the flying female wants?" he exclaimed at last. "You'd better stop, perhaps," he added to the flyman. "It is an age of eccentricity, an abnormal era of the world's history. She may want me. Very likely I left my pocket handkerchief behind me, and Mr. Talboys has sent this person with it. Perhaps I'd better get out and go and meet her. It's civil to send my handkerchief." Mr. Robert Audley deliberately descended from the fly, and walked slowly toward the hurrying female figure, which gained upon him rapidly. He was rather short-sighted, and it was not until she came very near to him that he saw who she was. "Good heaven!" he exclaimed. "It's Miss Talboys." It was Miss Talboys, flushed and breathless, with a woolen shawl thrown over her head. Robert Audley now saw her face clearly for the first time, and he saw that she was very handsome. She had brown eyes like George's, a pale complexion. She had been flushed when she approached him, but the color faded away as she recovered her breath. Regular features, with a mobility of expression which bore record of every change of feeling. He saw all this in a few moments, and he wondered only the more at the stoicism of her manner during his interview with Mr. Talboys. There were no tears in her eyes, but they were bright with a feverish luster, terribly bright and dry, and he could see that her lips trembled as she spoke to him. "Miss Talboys," he said, "what can I—why—" She interrupted him suddenly, catching at his wrist with her disengaged hand. She was holding her shawl in the other. "Oh, let me speak to you!" she cried. "Let me speak to you, or I shall go mad. I heard it all. I believe what you believe, and I shall go mad unless I can do something toward avenging his death." For a few moments Robert Audley was too much bewildered to answer her. Of all things possible upon earth he had least expected to behold her thus. "Take my arm, Miss Talboys," he said. "Pray calm yourself. Let us walk a little way back toward the house, and talk quietly. I would not have spoken as I did before you, had I known—"
"Had you known that I loved my brother?" she said quickly. "How should you know that I loved him? How should any one think that I loved him, when I have never had power to give him a welcome beneath that roof, or a kindly word from his father? How should I dare to betray my love for him in that house when I knew that even a sister's affection would be turned to his disadvantage? You do not know my father, Mr. Audley. I do. I knew that to intercede for George would have been to ruin his cause. I knew that to leave matters in my father's hands, and to trust to time, was my only chance of ever seeing that dear brother again. And I waited patiently, always hoping for the best, for I knew that my father loved his only son. I see your contemptuous smile, Mr. Audley, and I dare say it is difficult for a stranger to believe that underneath his affected stoicism my father conceals some degree of affection for his children. No very warm attachment, perhaps, for he has always ruled his life by the strict law of duty. Stop!" she said suddenly, laying her hand upon his arm, and looking back through the straight avenue of pines. "I ran out of the house by the back way. Papa must not see me talking to you, Mr. Audley, and he must not see the fly standing at the gate. Will you go into the high road and tell the man to drive on a little way? I will come out of the plantation by a little gate further on, and meet you in the road."
"But you will catch cold, Miss Talboys," remonstrated Robert, looking at her anxiously, for he saw that she was trembling. "You are shivering now."
"Not with cold," she answered. "I am thinking of my brother George. If you have any pity for the only sister of your lost friend, do what I ask you, Mr. Audley. I must speak to you. I must speak to you. Calmly, if I can."
She put her hand to her head as if trying to collect her thoughts, and then pointed to the gate. Robert bowed and left her. He told the man to drive slowly toward the station, and walked on by the side of the tarred fence surrounding Mr. Talboys' grounds. About 100 yards beyond the principal entrance he came to a little wooden gate in the fence, and waited at it for Miss Talboys. She joined him presently, with her shawl still over her head, and her eyes still bright and tearless. "Will you walk with me inside the plantation?" she said. "We might be observed on the high road." He bowed, passed through the gate, and shut it behind him. When she took his offered arm he found that she was still trembling very violently.
Pray calm yourself, Miss Talboys," he said. "I may have been deceived in the opinion which I have formed. I may—"
"No, no, no!" she exclaimed. "You are not deceived. My brother has been murdered. Tell me the name of that woman, the woman whom you suspect of being concerned in his disappearance, in his murder."
"That I cannot do until—"
"Until when?"
"Until I know that she is guilty."
You told my father that you would abandon all idea of discovering the truth; that you would rest satisfied to leave my brother's fate a horrible mystery never to be solved upon this earth; but you will not do so, Mr. Audley. You will not be false to the memory of your friend. You will see vengeance done upon those who have destroyed him. You will do this, will you not?"
A gloomy shadow spread itself like a dark veil over Robert Audley's handsome face. He remembered what he had said the day before at Southampton.
"A hand that is stronger than my own is beckoning me onward, upon the dark road."
A quarter of an hour before he had believed that all was over, and that he was released from the dreadful duty of discovering the secret of George's death. Now this girl, this apparently passionless girl, had found a voice, and was urging him on toward his fate.
"If you knew what misery to me may be involved in discovering the truth, Miss Talboys," he said, "you would scarcely ask me to pursue this business any further."
"But I do ask you," she answered, with suppressed passion. "I do ask you. I ask you to avenge my brother's untimely death. Will you do so? Yes or no?"
"What if I answer no?"
"Then I will do it myself," she exclaimed, looking at him with her bright brown eyes. "I myself will follow up the clue to this mystery.
I will find this woman, though you refuse to tell me in what part of England my brother disappeared. I will travel from one end of the world to the other to find the secret of his fate, if you refuse to find it for me. I am of age, my own mistress, rich, for I have money left me by one of my aunts. I shall be able to employ those who will help me in my search, and I will make it to their interest to serve me well. Choose between the two alternatives, Mr. Audley. Shall you or I find my brother's murderer?" He looked in her face, and saw that her resolution was the fruit of no transient womanish enthusiasm which would give way under the iron hand of difficulty. Her beautiful features, naturally statuesque in their noble outlines, seemed transformed into marble by the rigidity of her expression. The face in which he looked was the face of a woman whom death only could turn from her purpose. "I have grown up in an atmosphere of suppression," she said quietly. "I have stifled and dwarfed the natural feelings of my heart until they have become unnatural in their intensity. I have been allowed neither friends nor lovers. My mother died when I was very young. My father has always been to me what you saw him today. I have had no one but my brother. All the love that my heart can hold has been centered upon him. Do you wonder, then, that when I hear that his young life has been ended by the hand of treachery, that I wish to see vengeance done upon the traitor? Oh, my God!" she cried, suddenly clasping her hands and looking up at the cold winter sky. "Lead me to the murder of my brother, and let mine be the hand to avenge his untimely death." Robert Audley stood looking at her with awe-stricken admiration. Her beauty was elevated into sublimity by the intensity of her suppressed passion. She was different to all other women that he had ever seen. His cousin was pretty, his uncle's wife was lovely, but Clara Talboys was beautiful. Niobe's face, sublimated by sorrow, could scarcely have been more purely classical than hers. Even her dress, Puritan in its gray simplicity, became her beauty better than a more beautiful dress would have become a less beautiful woman. "Miss Talboys," said Robert after a pause, "your brother shall not be unavenged. He shall not be forgotten. I do not think that any professional aid which you could procure would lead you as surely to the secret of this mystery as I can lead you, if you are patient and trust me." "I will trust you," she answered, "for I see that you will help me." "I believe that it is my destiny to do so," he said solemnly. In the whole course of his conversation with Harcourt Talboys, Robert Audley had carefully avoided making any deductions from the circumstances which he had submitted to George's father. He had simply told the story of the missing man's life, from the hour of his arriving in London to that of his disappearance, but he saw that Clara Talboys had arrived at the same conclusion as himself, and that it was tacitly understood between them. "Have you any letters of your brother's, Miss Talboys?" he asked. "Two. One written soon after his marriage, the other written at Liverpool, the night before he sailed for Australia." "Will you let me see them?" "Yes, I will send them to you if you will give me your address. You will write to me from time to time, will you not, to tell me whether you are approaching the truth? I shall be obliged to act secretly here, but I am going to leave home in 2 or 3 months, and I shall be perfectly free then to act as I please." "You are not going to leave England?" Robert asked. "Oh, no. I am only going to pay a long-promised visit to some friends in Essex." Robert started so violently as Clara Talboys said this that she looked suddenly at his face. The agitation visible there betrayed a part of his secret. "My brother George disappeared in Essex," she said. He could not contradict her. "I am sorry you have discovered so much," he replied. "My position becomes every day more complicated, every day more painful. Good-bye." She gave him her hand mechanically when he held out his, but it was as cold as marble, and lay listlessly in his own, and fell like a log at her side when he released it. "Pray lose no time in returning to the house," he said earnestly. "I fear you will suffer from this morning's work." "Suffer!" she exclaimed scornfully. "You talk to me of suffering, when the only creature in this world who ever loved me has been taken from it in the bloom of youth. What can there be for me henceforth but suffering? What is the cold to me?" she said, flinging back her shawl and baring her beautiful head to the bitter wind. "I would walk from here to London, barefoot through the snow, and never stop by the way if I could bring him back to life.
What would I not do to bring him back? What would I not do?"
The words broke from her in a wail of passionate sorrow, and clasping her hands before her face, she wept for the first time that day. The violence of her sobs shook her slender frame, and she was obliged to lean against the trunk of a tree for support. Robert looked at her with a tender compassion in his face. She was so like the friend whom he had loved and lost that it was impossible for him to think of her as a stranger, impossible to remember that they had met that morning for the first time. "Pray, pray be calm," he said. "Hope even against hope. We may both be deceived. Your brother may still live."
"Oh, if it were so!" she murmured passionately. "If it could be so!"
"Let us try and hope that it may be so." "No," she answered, looking at him through her tears. "Let us hope for nothing but revenge. Good-bye, Mr. Audley. Stop! Your address." He gave her a card which she put into the pocket of her dress. "I will send you George's letters," she said. "They may help you. Good-bye." She left him half bewildered by the passionate energy of her manner and the noble beauty of her face. He watched her as she disappeared among the straight trunks of the fir trees, and then walked slowly out of the plantation. "Heaven help those who stand between me and the secret," he thought, "for they will be sacrificed to the memory of George Talboys." Chapter 23. Lady Audley's Secret, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 24. George's Letters. Robert Audley did not return to Southampton, but took a ticket for the first up-town train that left Wareham, and reached Waterloo Bridge an hour or two after dark. The snow, which had been hard and crisp in Dorsetshire, was a black and greasy slush in the Waterloo road, thawed by the flaring lamps of the gin palaces and the glaring gas in the butchers' shops. Robert Audley shrugged his shoulders as he looked at the dingy streets through which the hansom carried him, the cabman choosing, with that delicious instinct which seems innate in the drivers of hackney vehicles, all those dark and hideous thoroughfares utterly unknown to the ordinary pedestrian. "What a pleasant thing life is," thought the barrister. "What an unspeakable boon, what an overpowering blessing. Let any man make a calculation of his existence, subtracting the hours in which he has been thoroughly happy, really and entirely at his ease, without one arrière-pensée to mar his enjoyment, without the most infinitesimal cloud to overshadow the brightness of his horizon. Let him do this, and surely he will laugh in utter bitterness of soul when he sets down the sum of his felicity and discovers the pitiful smallness of the amount. He will have enjoyed himself for a week or 10 days in 30 years, perhaps. In 30 years of dull December, and blustering March, and showery April, and dark November weather, there may have been 7 or 8 glorious August days, through which the sun has blazed in cloudless radiance, and summer breezes have breathed perpetual balm. How fondly we recollect those solitary days of pleasure, and hope for their recurrence, and try to plan the circumstances that made them bright, and arrange and predestinate, and diplomatize with fate for a renewal of the remembered joy. As if any joy could ever be built up out of such and such constituent parts; as if happiness were not essentially accidental, a bright and wandering bird, utterly irregular in its migrations. With us one summer's day, and for ever gone from us on the next. Look at marriage, for instance," mused Robert, who was as meditative in the jolting vehicle for whose occupation he was to pay 6 pence a mile, as if he had been riding a mustang on the wild loneliness of the prairies. "Look at marriage. Who is to say which shall be the one judicious selection out of 999 mistakes? Who shall decide from the first aspect of the slimy creature which is to be the one eel out of the colossal bag of snakes? That girl on the curbstone yonder, waiting to cross the street when my chariot shall have passed, may be the one woman out of every female creature in this vast universe who could make me a happy man. Yet I pass her by, bespatter her with the mud from my wheels, in my helpless ignorance, in my blind submission to the awful hand of fatality. If that girl, Clara Talboys, had been 5 minutes later, I should have left Dorsetshire thinking her cold, hard, and unwomanly, and should have gone to my grave with that mistake part and parcel of my mind. I took her for a stately and heartless automaton. I know her now to be a noble and beautiful woman.
what an incalculable difference this may make in my life. When I left that house, I went out into the winter day with the determination of abandoning all further thought of the secret of George's death. I see her, and she forces me onward upon the loathsome path, the crooked byway of watchfulness and suspicion. How can I say to this sister of my dead friend, I believe that your brother has been murdered, I believe that I know by whom, but I will take no step to set my doubts at rest or to confirm my fears? I cannot say this. This woman knows half my secret. She will soon possess herself of the rest, and then. The cab stopped in the midst of Robert Audley's meditation, and he had to pay the cabman, and submit to all the dreary mechanism of life, which is the same whether we are glad or sorry, whether we are to be married or hung, elevated to the woolsack, or disbarred by our brother benchers on some mysterious technical tangle of wrongdoing, which is a social enigma to those outside the forum domesticum of the Middle Temple. We are apt to be angry with this cruel hardness in our life, this unflinching regularity in the smaller wheels and meaner mechanism of the human machine, which knows no stoppage or cessation, though the mainspring be forever hollow, and the hands pointing to purposeless figures on a shattered dial. Who has not felt, in the first madness of sorrow, an unreasoning rage against the mute propriety of chairs and tables, the stiff squareness of Turkey carpets, the unbending obstinacy of the outward apparatus of existence? We want to root up gigantic trees in a primeval forest, and to tear their huge branches asunder in our convulsive grasp, and the utmost that we can do for the relief of our passion is to knock over an easy-chair, or smash a few shillings' worth of Mr. Copeland's manufacture. Madhouses are large and only too numerous, and yet surely it is strange they are not larger, when we think of how many helpless wretches must beat their brains against this hopeless persistency of the orderly outward world, as compared with the storm and tempest, the riot and confusion within, when we remember how many minds must tremble upon the narrow boundary between reason and unreason, mad today and sane tomorrow, mad yesterday and sane today. Robert Audley had directed the cabman to drop him at the corner of Chancery Lane, and he ascended the brilliantly lighted staircase leading to the dining saloon of the London, and seated himself at one of the snug tables with a confused sense of emptiness and weariness, rather than any agreeable sensation of healthy hunger. He had come to the luxurious eating-house to dine, because it was absolutely necessary to eat something somewhere, and a great deal easier to get a very good dinner from Mr. Sawyer than a very bad one from Mrs. Maloney, whose mind ran in one narrow channel of chops and steaks, only variable by small creeks and outlets in the way of broiled sole or boiled mackerel. The solicitous waiter tried in vain to rouse poor Robert to a proper sense of the solemnity of the dinner question. He muttered something to the effect that the man might bring him anything he liked, and the friendly waiter, who knew Robert as a frequent guest at the little tables, went back to his master with a doleful face, to say that Mr. Audley, from Figtree Court, was evidently out of spirits. Robert ate his dinner and drank a pint of Moselle, but he had poor appreciation of the excellence of the viands, or the delicate fragrance of the wine. The mental monologue still went on, and the young philosopher of the modern school was arguing the favorite modern question of the nothingness of everything, and the folly of taking too much trouble to walk upon a road that went nowhere, or to compass a work that meant nothing. "I accept the dominion of that pale girl with the statuesque features and the calm brown eyes," he thought. "I recognize the power of a mind superior to my own, and I yield to it, and bow down to it. I've been acting for myself, and thinking for myself, for the last few months, and I'm tired of the unnatural business. I've been false to the leading principle of my life, and I've suffered for the folly. I found 2 gray hairs in my head the week before last, and an impertinent crow has planted a delicate impression of his foot under my right eye. Yes, I'm getting old upon the right side. And why? Why should it be so?" He pushed away his plate and lifted his eyebrows, staring at the crumbs upon the glistening damask as he pondered the question. "What the devil am I doing in this galère?" he asked. "But I am in it, and I can't get out of it, so I better submit myself to the brown-eyed girl, and do what she tells me patiently and faithfully. What a wonderful solution to life's enigma there is in petticoat government. Man might lie in the sunshine and eat lotuses, and fancy it always afternoon if his wife would let him. But she won't, bless her impulsive heart and active mind.
She knows better than that. Whoever heard of a woman taking life as it ought to be taken? Instead of supporting it as an unavoidable nuisance, only redeemable by its brevity, she goes through it as if it were a pageant or a procession. She dresses for it, and simpers and grins and gesticulates for it. She pushes her neighbors and struggles for a good place in the dismal march. She elbows and writhes, and tramples and prances to the one end, making the most of the misery. She gets up early and sits up late, and is loud and restless and noising and unpitying. She drags her husband on to the woolsack, or pushes him into Parliament. She drives him full butt at the dear, lazy machinery of government, and knocks and buffets him about the wheels and cranks and screws and pulleys, until somebody, for quiet's sake, makes him something that she wanted him to be made. That's why incompetent men sometimes sit in high places, and interpose their poor muddled intellects between the things to be done and the people that can do them, making universal confusion in the helpless innocence of well-placed incapacity. The square men in the round holes are pushed into them by their wives. The Eastern potentate, who declared that women were at the bottom of all mischief, should have gone a little further and seen why it is so. It is because women are never lazy. They don't know what it is to be quiet. They are Semiramides and Cleopatras and Joans of Arc, Queen Elizabeths and Catherines II, and they riot and battle and murder and clamor and desperation. If they can't agitate the universe and play at ball with hemispheres, they'll make mountains of warfare and vexation out of domestic molehills, and social storms and household teacups. Forbid them to hold forth upon the freedom of nations and the wrongs of mankind, and they'll quarrel with Mrs. Jones about the shape of a mantle or the character of a small maidservant. To call them the weaker sex is to utter a hideous mockery. They are the stronger sex, the noisier, the more persevering, the most self-assertive sex. They want freedom of opinion, variety of occupation, do they? Let them have it. Let them be lawyers, doctors, preachers, teachers, soldiers, legislators, anything they like, but let them be quiet, if they can."
Mr. Audley pushed his hands through the thick luxuriance of his straight brown hair, and uplifted the dark mass in his despair.
"I hate women," he thought savagely. "They're bold, brazen, abominable creatures, invented for the annoyance and destruction of their superiors. Look at this business of poor George's. It's all woman's work from one end to the other. He marries a woman, and his father casts him off penniless and professionless. He hears of the woman's death, and he breaks his heart, his good, honest, manly heart, worth 1,000,000 of the treacherous lumps of self-interest and mercenary calculation which beat in women's breasts. He goes to a woman's house, and he is never seen alive again. And now I find myself driven into a corner by another woman, of whose existence I had never thought until this day. And then," mused Mr. Audley, rather irrelevantly, "there's Alicia, too. She's another nuisance. She'd like me to marry her, I know, and she'll make me do it, I dare say, before she's done with me. But I'd much rather not. Though she is a dear, bouncing, generous thing, bless her poor little heart."
Robert paid his bill and rewarded the waiter liberally. The young barrister was very willing to distribute his comfortable little income among the people who served him, for he carried his indifference to all things in the universe, even to the matter of pounds, shillings, and pence. Perhaps he was rather exceptional in this, as you may frequently find that the philosopher who calls life an empty delusion is pretty sharp in the investment of his moneys, and recognizes the tangible nature of India bonds, Spanish certificates, and Egyptian scrip, as contrasted with the painful uncertainty of an ego or non-ego in metaphysics. The snug rooms in Fig Tree Court seemed dreary in their orderly quiet to Robert Audley upon this particular evening. He had no inclination for his French novels, though there was a packet of uncut romances, comic and sentimental, ordered a month before, waiting his pleasure upon one of the tables. He took his favorite meerschaum, and dropped into his favorite chair with a sigh.
"It's comfortable, but it seems so deuced lonely tonight. If poor George were sitting opposite to me, or even George's sister. She's very like him. Existence might be a little more endurable. But when a fellow's lived by himself for 8 or 10 years, he begins to be bad company."
He burst out laughing presently as he finished his first pipe.
"The idea of my thinking of George's sister," he thought. "What a preposterous idiot I am."
The next day's post brought him a letter in a firm but feminine hand which was strange to him. He found the little packet lying on his breakfast table,
beside the warm French roll wrapped in a napkin by Mrs. Maloney's careful but rather dirty hands. He contemplated the envelope for some minutes before opening it, not in any wonder as to his correspondent, for the letter bore the postmark of Grange Heath, and he knew that there was only one person who was likely to write to him from that obscure village, but in that lazy dreaminess which was a part of his character. "From Clara Talboys," he murmured slowly, as he looked critically at the clearly shaped letters of his name and address. "Yes, from Clara Talboys, most decidedly. I recognized a feminine resemblance to poor George's hand. Neater than his, and more decided than his, but very like, very like." He turned the letter over and examined the seal which bore his friend's familiar crest. "I wonder what she says to me," he thought. "It's a long letter, I dare say. She's the kind of woman who would write a long letter. A letter that will urge me on, drive me forward, wrench me out of myself, I've no doubt. But that can't be helped, so here goes." He tore open the envelope with a sigh of resignation. It contained nothing but George's 2 letters and a few words written on the flap. "I send the letters. Please preserve and return them. C.T." The letter, written from Liverpool, told nothing of the writer's life except his sudden determination of starting for a new world, to redeem the fortunes that had been ruined in the old. The letter, written almost immediately after George's marriage, contained a full description of his wife, such a description as a man could only write within 3 weeks of a love match, a description in which every feature was minutely catalogued, every grace of form or beauty of expression fondly dwelt upon, every charm of manner lovingly depicted. Robert Audley read the letter 3 times before he laid it down. "If George could have known for what a purpose this description would serve when he wrote it," thought the young barrister, "surely his hand would have fallen paralyzed by horror, and powerless to shape one syllable of these tender words." End of Chapter 24. Lady Audley's Secret, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 25. Retrograde Investigation. The dreary London January dragged its dull length slowly out. The last slender records of Christmas time were swept away, and Robert Audley still lingered in town, still spent his lonely evenings in his quiet sitting-room in Fig-tree Court, still wandered listlessly in the Temple Gardens on sunny mornings, absently listening to the children's babble, idly watching their play. He had many friends among the inhabitants of the quaint old buildings round him. He had other friends far away in pleasant country places, whose spare bedrooms were always at Bob's service, whose cheerful firesides had snugly luxurious chairs specially allotted to him. But he seemed to have lost all taste for companionship, all sympathy with the pleasures and occupations of his class, since the disappearance of George Talboys. Elderly benchers indulged in facetious observations upon the young man's pale face and moody manner. They suggested the probability of some unhappy attachment, some feminine ill-usage as the secret cause of the change. They told him to be of good cheer, and invited him to supper parties, at which "lovely woman with all her faults, God bless her," was drunk by gentlemen who shed tears as they proposed the toast, and were maudlin and unhappy in their cups toward the close of the entertainment. Robert had no inclination for the wine-bibbing and the punch-making. The one idea of his life had become his master. He was the bonden slave of one gloomy thought, one horrible presentiment. A dark cloud was brooding above his uncle's house, and it was his hand which was to give the signal for the thunderclap, and the tempest that was to ruin that noble life. "If she would only take warning and run away," he said to himself sometimes. "Heaven knows I have given her a fair chance. Why doesn't she take it and run away?" He heard sometimes from Sir Michael, sometimes from Alicia. The young lady's letter rarely contained more than a few curt lines informing him that her papa was well, and that Lady Audley was in very high spirits, amusing herself in her usual frivolous manner, and with her usual disregard for other people. A letter from Mr. Marchmont, the Southampton schoolmaster, informed Robert that little Georgie was going on very well, but that he was behindhand in his education, and had not yet passed the intellectual Rubicon of words of 2 syllables. Captain Maldon had called to see his grandson, but that privilege had been withheld from him, in accordance with Mr. Audley's instructions. The old man had furthermore sent a parcel of pastry and sweetmeats to the little boy, which had also been rejected on the ground of indigestible and bilious tendencies in the edibles. Toward the close of February, Robert received a letter from his cousin Alicia, which hurried him one step further forward toward his destiny, by causing him to return to the house from which he had become in a manner exiled at the instigation of his uncle's wife. "Papa is very ill," Alicia wrote. "Not dangerously ill, thank God, but confined to his room by an attack of low fever which has succeeded a violent cold. Come and see him, Robert, if you have any regard for your nearest relations. He has spoken about you several times, and I know he will be glad to have you with him. Come at once, but say nothing about this letter. From your affectionate cousin, Alicia." A sick and deadly terror chilled Robert Audley's heart as he read this letter, a vague yet hideous fear, which he dared not shape into any definite form. "Have I done right," he thought, in the first agony of this new horror, "have I done right to tamper with justice, and to keep the secret of my doubts in the hope that I was shielding those I love from sorrow and disgrace? What shall I do if I find him ill, very ill, dying perhaps, dying upon her breast? What shall I do?" One course lay clear before him, and the first step of that course was a rapid journey to Audley Court. He packed his portmanteau, jumped into a cab, and reached the railway station within an hour of his receipt of Alicia's letter, which had come by the afternoon post. The dim village lights flickered faintly through the growing dusk when Robert reached Audley. He left his portmanteau with the station-master, and walked at a leisurely pace through the quiet lanes that led away to the still loneliness of the Court. The overarching trees stretched their leafless branches above his head, bare and weird in the dusky light. A low moaning wind swept across the flat meadow land, and tossed those rugged branches hither and thither against the dark gray sky. They looked like the ghostly arms of shrunken and withered giants beckoning Robert to his uncle's house. They looked like threatening phantoms in the chill winter twilight, gesticulating to him to hasten upon his journey. The long avenue, so bright and pleasant when the perfumed limes scattered their light bloom upon the pathway, and the dog-rose leaves floated on the summer air, was terribly bleak and desolate in the cheerless interregnum that divides the homely joys of Christmas from the pale blush of coming spring, a dead pause in the year, in which nature seems to lie in a tranced sleep, awaiting the wondrous signal for the budding of the flower. A mournful presentiment crept into Robert Audley's heart as he drew nearer to his uncle's house. Every changing outline in the landscape was familiar to him, every bend of the trees, every caprice of the untrammeled branches, every undulation in the bare hawthorn hedge, broken by dwarf horse-chestnuts, stunted willows, blackberry, and hazel bushes. Sir Michael had been a second father to the young man, a generous and noble friend, a grave and earnest adviser, and perhaps the strongest sentiment of Robert's heart was his love for the gray-bearded baronet. But the grateful affection was so much a part of himself that it seldom found an outlet in words, and a stranger would never have fathomed the depth of feeling which lay, a deep and powerful current, beneath the stagnant surface of the barrister's character. "What would become of this place if my uncle were to die?" he thought, and he drew nearer to the ivied archway and the still water-pools, coldly gray in the twilight. "Would other people live in the old house, and sit under the low oak ceilings in the homely, familiar rooms?" That wonderful faculty of association, so interwoven with the inmost fibers of even the hardest nature, filled the young man's breast with a prophetic pain as he remembered that, however long or late, the day must come on which the oaken shutters would be closed for a while, and the sunshine shut out of the house he loved. It was painful to him even to remember this, as it must always be painful to think of the narrow lease the greatest upon this earth can ever hold of its grandeurs. Is it so wonderful that some wayfarers drop asleep under the hedges, scarcely caring to toil onward on a journey that leads to no abiding habitation? Is it wonderful that there have been quietists in the world ever since Christ's religion was first preached upon earth? Is it strange that there is a patient endurance and tranquil resignation, calm expectation of that which is to come on the furthest shore of the dark flowing river? Is it not rather to be wondered that anybody should ever care to be great for greatness' sake, for any other reason than pure conscientiousness, the simple fidelity of the servant who fears to lay his talents by in a napkin, knowing that indifference is near akin to dishonesty? If Robert Audley had lived in the time of Thomas à Kempis, he would very likely have built himself a narrow hermitage amid some forest loneliness, and spent his life in tranquil imitation of the reputed author of the Imitation. As it was, Figtree Court was a pleasant hermitage in its way, and for breviaries and books of hours, I am ashamed to say the young barrister substituted Paul de Kock and Dumas fils. But his sins were of so simply negative an order, that it would have been very easy for him to have abandoned them for negative virtues. Only one solitary light was visible in the long irregular range of windows facing the archway, as Robert passed under the gloomy shade of the rustling ivy, restless in the chill moaning of the wind. He recognized that lighted window as the large oriel in his uncle's room. When last he had looked at the old house it had been gay with visitors, every window glittering like a low star in the dusk. Now, dark and silent, it faced the winter's night like some dismal baronial habitation, deep in a woodland solitude. The man who opened the door to the unlooked-for visitor brightened as he recognized his master's nephew. "Sir Michael will be cheered up a bit, sir, by the sight of you," he said, as he ushered Robert Audley into the firelit library, which seemed desolate by reason of the baronet's easy-chair standing empty on the broad hearth-rug. "Shall I bring you some dinner here, sir, before you go upstairs?" the servant asked. "My lady and Miss Audley have dined early during my master's illness, but I can bring you anything you would please to take, sir." "I'll take nothing until I have seen my uncle," Robert answered hurriedly. "That is to say, if I can see him at once. He is not too ill to receive me, I suppose?" he added anxiously. "Oh, no, sir, not too ill. Only a little low, sir. This way, if you please." He conducted Robert up the short flight of shallow oaken stairs to the octagon chamber in which George Talboys had sat long 5 months before, staring absently at my lady's portrait. The picture was finished now, and hung in the post of honor opposite the window, amidst Claudes, Poussins, and Wouvermans, whose less brilliant hues were killed by the vivid coloring of the modern artist. The bright face looked out of that tangled glitter of golden hair, in which the pre-Raphaelites delight, with a mocking smile, as Robert paused for a moment to glance at the well-remembered picture. 2 or 3 moments afterward he had passed through my lady's boudoir and dressing-room, and stood upon the threshold of Sir Michael's room. The baronet lay in a quiet sleep, his arm laying outside the bed, and his strong hand clasped in his young wife's delicate fingers. Alicia sat in a low chair beside the broad open hearth, on which the huge logs burned fiercely in the frosty atmosphere. The interior of this luxurious bedchamber might have made a striking picture for an artist's pencil. The massive furniture, dark and somber, yet broken up and relieved here and there by scraps of gilding and masses of glowing color. The elegance of every detail, in which wealth was subservient to purity of taste, and last, but greatest in importance, the graceful figures of the 2 women, and the noble form of the old man would have formed a worthy study for any painter. Lucy Audley, with her disordered hair in a pale haze of yellow gold about her thoughtful face, the flowing lines of her soft muslin dressing-gown falling in straight folds to her feet, and clasped at the waist by a narrow circlet of agate links, might have served as a model for a medieval saint, in one of the tiny chapels hidden away in the nooks and corners of a gray old cathedral, unchanged by Reformation or Cromwell. And what saintly martyr of the Middle Ages could have borne a holier aspect than the man whose gray beard lay upon the dark silken coverlet of the stately bed? Robert paused upon the threshold, fearful of awaking his uncle. The 2 ladies had heard his step, cautious though he had been, and lifted their heads to look at him. My lady's face, quietly watching the sick man, had worn an anxious earnestness which made it only more beautiful, but the same face, recognizing Robert Audley, faded from its delicate brightness, and looked scared and wan in the lamplight. "Mr. Audley," she cried, in a faint, tremulous voice. "Hush!" whispered Alicia, with a warning gesture. "You will wake papa. How good of you to come, Robert," she added in the same whispered tones, beckoning to her cousin to take an empty chair near the bed. The young man seated himself in the indicated seat at the bottom of the bed, and opposite to my lady, who sat close beside the pillows. He looked long and earnestly at the face of the sleeper, still longer, still more earnestly at the face of Lady Audley, which was slowly recovering its natural hues. "He has not been very ill, has he?" Robert asked, in the same key as that in which Alicia had spoken. My lady answered the question. "Oh, no, not dangerously ill," she said, without taking her eyes from her husband's face. "But still we have been anxious, very, very anxious." Robert never relaxed his scrutiny of that pale face. "She shall look at me," he thought. "I will make her meet my eyes, and I will read her as I have read her before. She shall know how useless her artifices are with me." He paused for a few minutes before he spoke again. The regular breathing of the sleeper, the ticking of a gold hunting watch at the head of the bed, and the crackling of the burning logs were the only sounds that broke the stillness. "I have no doubt you have been anxious, Lady Audley," Robert said after a pause, fixing my lady's eyes as they wandered furtively to his face. "There is no one to whom my uncle's life can be of more value than to you. Your happiness, your prosperity, your safety depend alike upon his existence." The whisper in which he uttered these words was too low to reach the other side of the room where Alicia sat. Lucy Audley's met those of the speaker with some gleam of triumph in their light. "I know that," she said. "Those who strike me must strike through him." She pointed to the sleeper as she spoke, still looking at Robert Audley. She defied him with her blue eyes, their brightness intensified by the triumph in their glance. She defied him with her quiet smile, a smile of fatal beauty, full of lurking significance and mysterious meaning, the smile which the artist had exaggerated in his portrait of Sir Michael's wife. Robert turned away from the lovely face, and shaded his eyes with his hand, putting a barrier between my lady and himself, a screen which baffled her penetration and provoked her curiosity. Was he still watching her, or was he thinking, and of what was he thinking? Robert had been seated at the bedside for upward of an hour before his uncle awoke. The baronet was delighted at his nephew's coming. "It was very good of you to come to me, Bob," he said. "I have been thinking of you a good deal since I have been ill. You and Lucy must be good friends, you know, Bob, and you must learn to think of her as your aunt, sir, though she is young and beautiful, and you understand, eh?" Robert grasped his uncle's hand, but he looked down as he answered. "I do understand you, sir," he said quietly, "and I give you my word of honor that I am steeled against my lady's fascinations. She knows that as well as I do." Lucy Audley made a little grimace with her pretty little lips. "Bah, you silly Robert," she exclaimed. "You take everything au sérieux. If I thought you were rather too young for a nephew, it was only in my fear of other people's foolish gossip, not from any—" She hesitated for a moment, and escaped any conclusion to her sentence by the timely intervention of Mr. Dawson, her late employer, who entered the room upon his evening visit while she was speaking. He felt the patient's pulse, asked 2 or 3 questions, pronounced the baronet to be steadily improving, exchanged a few commonplace remarks with Alicia and Lady Audley, and prepared to leave the room. Robert rose and accompanied him to the door. "I will light you to the staircase," he said, taking a candle from one of the tables, and lighting it at the lamp. "No, no, Mr. Audley, pray do not trouble yourself," expostulated the surgeon. "I know my way very well indeed." Robert insisted, and the 2 men left the room together. As they entered the octagon antechamber, the barrister paused and shut the door behind him. "Will you see that the door is closed, Mr. Dawson?" he said, pointing to that which opened upon the staircase. "I wish to have a few moments' private conversation with you." "With much pleasure," replied the surgeon, complying with Robert's request. "But if you are at all alarmed about your uncle, Mr. Audley, I can set your mind at rest. There is no occasion for the least uneasiness. Had his illness been at all serious, I should have telegraphed immediately for the family physician." "I am sure that you would have done your duty, sir," answered Robert gravely. "But I am not going to speak of my uncle. I wish to ask you 2 or 3 questions about another person." "Indeed?" "The person who once lived in your family as Miss Lucy Graham. The person who is now Lady Audley." Mr. Dawson looked up with an expression of surprise upon his quiet face. "Pardon me, Mr. Audley," he answered. "You can scarcely expect me to answer any questions about your uncle's wife without Sir Michael's express permission. I can understand no motive which can prompt you to ask such questions—no worthy motive, at least." He looked severely at the young man, as much as to say, "You have been falling in love with your uncle's pretty wife, sir, and you want to make me a go-between in some treacherous flirtation; but it won't do, sir, it won't do." "I always respected the lady as Miss Graham, sir," he said, "and I esteem her doubly as Lady Audley, not on account of her altered position, but because she is the wife of one of the noblest men in Christendom." "You cannot respect my uncle nor my uncle's honor more sincerely than I do," answered Robert.
I have no unworthy motive for the questions I am about to ask, and you must answer them."
"Must?"
echoed Mr. Dawson indignantly. "Yes, you are my uncle's friend. It was at your house he met the woman who is now his wife. She called herself an orphan, I believe, and enlisted his pity as well as his admiration in her behalf. She told him that she stood alone in the world, did she not, without a friend or relative? This was all I could ever learn of her antecedents."
"What reason have you to wish to know more?" asked the surgeon.
"A very terrible reason," answered Robert Audley. "For some months past I have struggled with doubts and suspicions which have embittered my life. They have grown stronger every day, and they will not be set at rest by the commonplace sophistries and the shallow arguments with which men try to deceive themselves rather than believe that which of all things upon earth they most fear to believe. I do not think that the woman who bears my uncle's name is worthy to be his wife. I may wrong her. Heaven grant that it is so. But if I do, the fatal chain of circumstantial evidence never yet linked itself so closely about an innocent person. I wish to set my doubts at rest, or to confirm my fears. There is but one manner in which I can do this. I must trace the life of my uncle's wife backward, minutely and carefully, from this night to a period of 6 years ago. This is the 24th of February, '59. I want to know every record of her life between tonight and the February of the year '53. "And your motive is a worthy one?" "Yes. I wish to clear her from a very dreadful suspicion." "Which exists only in your mind?" "And in the mind of one other person." "May I ask who that person is?" "No, Mr. Dawson," answered Robert decisively. "I cannot reveal anything more than what I have already told you. I am a very irresolute, vacillating man in most things. In this matter I am compelled to be decided. I repeat once more that I must know the history of Lucy Graham's life. If you refuse to help me to the small extent in your power, I will find others who will help me. Painful as it would become, I will ask my uncle for the information which you would withhold, rather than be baffled in the first step of my investigation."
Mr. Dawson was silent for some minutes.
"I cannot express how much you have astonished and alarmed me, Mr. Audley," he said. "I can tell you so little about Lady Audley's antecedents that it would be mere obstinacy to withhold the small amount of information I possess. I have always considered your uncle's wife one of the most amiable of women. I cannot bring myself to think her otherwise. It would be an uprooting of one of the strongest convictions of my life were I compelled to think her otherwise. You wish to follow her life backward from the present hour to the year '53? "I do. She was married to your uncle last June 12th in the midsummer of '57. She had lived in my house a little more than 13 months. She became a member of my household upon the 14th of May in the year '56. "And she came to you—" "From a school in Brompton, a school kept by a lady of the name of Vincent. It was Mrs. Vincent's strong recommendation that induced me to receive Miss Graham into my family without any more special knowledge of her antecedents." "Did you see this Mrs. Vincent?" "I did not. I advertised for a governess, and Miss Graham answered my advertisement. In her letter she referred me to Mrs. Vincent, the proprietress of a school in which she was then residing as junior teacher. My time is always so fully occupied that I was glad to escape the necessity of a day's loss in going from Audley to London to inquire about the young lady's qualifications. I looked for Mrs. Vincent's name in the directory, found it, and concluded that she was a responsible person, and wrote to her. Her reply was perfectly satisfactory. Miss Lucy Graham was assiduous and conscientious, as well as fully qualified for the situation I offered. I accepted this reference, and I had no cause to regret what may have been an indiscretion. And now, Mr. Audley, I have told you all that I have the power to tell." "Will you be so kind as to give me the address of this Mrs. Vincent?" asked Robert, taking out his pocket-book. "Certainly. She was then living at No. 9 Crescent Villas, Brompton."
"Ah, to be sure," muttered Mr. Audley, a recollection of last September flashing suddenly back upon him as the surgeon spoke.
"Crescent Villas, yes, I have heard the address before from Lady Audley herself. This Mrs. Vincent telegraphed to my uncle's wife early in last September. She was ill, dying, I believe, and sent for my lady,
but had removed from her old house and was not to be found." "Indeed? I never heard Lady Audley mention the circumstance." "Perhaps not. It occurred while I was down here. Thank you, Mr. Dawson, for the information you have so kindly and honestly given me. It takes me back 2.5 years in the history of my lady's life, but I still have a blank of 3 years to fill up before I can exonerate her from my terrible suspicion. Good evening."
Robert shook hands with the surgeon and returned to his uncle's room. He had been away about a quarter of an hour. Sir Michael had fallen asleep once more, and my lady's loving hands had lowered the heavy curtains and shaded the lamp by the bedside. Alicia and her father's wife were taking tea in Lady Audley's boudoir, the room next to the antechamber in which Robert and Mr. Dawson had been seated. Lucy Audley looked up from her occupation among the fragile china cups, and watched Robert rather anxiously as he walked softly to his uncle's room and back again to the boudoir. She looked very pretty and innocent, seated behind the graceful group of delicate opal china and glittering silver. Surely a pretty woman never looks prettier than when making tea. The most feminine and most domestic of all occupations imparts a magic harmony to her every movement, a witchery to her every glance. The floating mists from the boiling liquid in which she infuses the soothing herbs, whose secrets are known to her alone, envelop her in a cloud of scented vapor, through which she seems a social fairy, weaving potent spells with gunpowder and bohea. At the tea-table she reigns omnipotent, unapproachable. What do men know of the mysterious beverage? Read how poor Hazlitt made his tea, and shudder at the dreadful barbarism. How clumsily the wretched creatures attempt to assist the witch president of the tea-tray. How hopelessly they hold the kettle, how continually they imperil the frail cups and saucers, or the taper hands of the priestess. To do away with the tea-table is to rob woman of her legitimate empire. To send a couple of hulking men about among your visitors, distributing a mixture made in the housekeeper's room, is to reduce the most social and friendly of ceremonies to a formal giving out of rations. Better the pretty influence of the teacups and saucers gracefully wielded in a woman's hand than all the inappropriate power snatched at the point of the pen from the unwilling sterner sex. Imagine all the women of England elevated to the high level of masculine intellectuality, superior to crinoline, above pearl powder and Mrs. Rachel Levinson, above taking the pains to be pretty, above tea-tables and that cruelly scandalous and rather satirical gossip which even strong men delight in, and what a drear, utilitarian, ugly life the sterner sex must lead. My lady was by no means strong-minded. The starry diamonds upon her white fingers flashed hither and thither among the tea-things, and she bent her pretty head over the marvelous Indian tea-caddy of sandalwood and silver, with as much earnestness as if life held no higher purpose than the infusion of bohea. "You'll take a cup of tea with us, Mr. Audley?" she asked, pausing with the teapot in her hand to look up at Robert, who was standing near the door.
"If you please."
"But you have not dined, perhaps? Shall I ring and tell them to bring you something a little more substantial than biscuits and transparent bread and butter?"
"No, thank you, Lady Audley. I took some lunch before I left town. I'll trouble you for nothing but a cup of tea."
He seated himself at the little table and looked across it at his cousin Alicia, who sat with a book in her lap, and had the air of being very much absorbed by its pages. The bright brunette complexion had lost its glowing crimson, and the animation of the young lady's manner was suppressed, on account of her father's illness, no doubt, Robert thought.
"Alicia, my dear,"
the barrister said, after a very leisurely contemplation of his cousin,
"you are not looking well."
Miss Audley shrugged her shoulders, but did not condescend to lift her eyes from her book. "Perhaps not," she answered contemptuously. "What does it matter? I'm growing a philosopher of your school, Robert Audley. What does it matter? Who cares whether I am well or ill?"
"What a spitfire she is," thought the barrister.
He always knew his cousin was angry with him when she addressed him as Robert Audley.
"You needn't pitch into a fellow because he asks you a civil question, Alicia," he said reproachfully. "As to nobody caring about your health, that's nonsense. I care."
Miss Audley looked up with a bright smile.
"Sir Harry Towers cares."
Miss Audley returned to her book with a frown.
"What are you reading there, Alicia?" Robert asked after a pause, during which he had thoughtfully sat stirring his tea.
"Changes and Chances."
"A novel?"
"Yes."
Who is it by?"
"The author of Follies and Faults," answered Alicia, still pursuing her study of the romance upon her lap.
"Is it interesting?"
Miss Audley pursed up her mouth and shrugged her shoulders. "Not particularly," she said.
"Then I think you might have better manners than to read it while your first cousin is sitting opposite you," observed Mr. Audley, with some gravity, "especially as he has only come to pay you a flying visit, and will be off tomorrow morning."
"Tomorrow morning!" exclaimed my lady, looking up suddenly. Though the look of joy upon Lady Audley's face was as brief as a flash of lightning on a summer sky, it was not unperceived by Robert.
"Yes," he said, "I shall be obliged to run up to London tomorrow on business, but I shall return the next day, if you will allow me, Lady Audley, and stay here till my uncle recovers."
"But you are not seriously alarmed about him, are you?" asked my lady anxiously. "You do not think him very ill?"
"No," answered Robert. "Thank Heaven, I think there is not the slightest cause for apprehension."
My lady sat silent for a few moments, looking at the empty teacups with a prettily thoughtful face, a face grave with the innocent seriousness of a musing child. "But you were closeted such a long time with Mr. Dawson just now," she said, after this brief pause. "I was quite alarmed at the length of your conversation. Were you talking of Sir Michael all the time?"
"No, not all the time."
My lady looked down at the teacups once more. "Why, what could you find to say to Mr. Dawson, or he to say to you?" she asked, after another pause. "You are almost strangers to each other."
"Suppose Mr. Dawson wished to consult me about some law business."
"Was that it?" cried Lady Audley, eagerly.
"It would be rather unprofessional to tell you if it were so, my lady," answered Robert gravely.
My lady bit her lip and relapsed into silence. Alicia threw down her book and watched her cousin's preoccupied face. He talked to her now and then for a few minutes, but it was evidently an effort to him to arouse himself from this reverie. "Upon my word, Robert Audley, you are a very agreeable companion," exclaimed Alicia at length, her rather limited stock of patience quite exhausted by 2 or 3 of these abortive attempts at conversation. "Perhaps the next time you come to the Court you will be good enough to bring your mind with you. By your present inanimate appearance, I should imagine that you had left your intellect, such as it is, somewhere in the Temple. You never were one of the liveliest of people, but latterly you have really grown almost unendurable. I suppose you are in love, Mr. Audley, and are thinking of the honored object of your affections." He was thinking of Clara Talboys' uplifted face, sublime in its unutterable grief, of her impassioned words still ringing in his ears as clearly as when they were first spoken. Again he saw her looking at him with her bright brown eyes. Again he heard that solemn question, "Shall you or I find my brother's murderer?" And he was in Essex, in the little village from which he firmly believed George Talboys had never departed. He was on the spot at which all record of his friend's life ended as suddenly as a story ends when the reader shuts the book. And could he withdraw now from the investigation which he found himself involved? Could he stop now, for any consideration? No, 1,000 times no. Not with the image of that grief-stricken face imprinted on his mind. Not with the accents of that earnest appeal ringing on his ear. Chapter 26.